Thank you very much, Clara. Thank you, everybody, for coming to the conference to listen to the talks, to honor Shura's memory. And I will talk about Czernowitz, our hometown, and its Jewish community. And I would like to focus on an interesting feature that I think not necessarily unique to Czernowitz, but relatively rare. And I call it Tsvishnkayt, or betweenness. I did not coin the word. It exists, albeit it's quite rare. So in the digitized corpus at the Yiddish Book Center, there are only several, I think 5 or 6 occurrences of this word, and so it definitely was not widely used, but which is also true about the English word betweenness. But now the word betweenness is getting more popular because in the theory of networks, this is an important parameter that reflects how well the components of a network are connected to each other, and how they can actually hold the network together by virtue of those various connections between the diverse parts. And so Czernowitz is a town that is located on a number of different boundaries. So it's literally between all kinds of different things, and that includes geographic boundaries, political, linguistic, cultural, religious, social, and so forth. And now, again, they're not really unusual. That happens in many places, but in Czernowitz, I think it was happening more or to a greater extent than in many other places. And so obviously I won't be able to talk about all of those things, but I'll rather just highlight, using some examples and anecdotes, some of those features and how I think they play a role in what was happening in Czernowitz over many years. So first, geographically, Czernowitz is a quintessential border town, and again, there are many borders in the world, and they are populated. What is interesting about Czernowitz is that located not on just a border between 2 entities, but rather it's a point where 3 very large and very, very distinct entities meet, and those are or were at different points. Now all those boundaries are fluid. They change over time, sometimes rapidly. And so Czernowitz is located in a place where the borders of 3 major European empires are sort of getting together. And those are Russian Empire, former Russian Empire on the east, and Austro-Hungarian Empire from the west, and from the south it is what used to be an Ottoman Empire, which and Czernowitz actually was the northernmost tip point of the Ottoman Empire. The city belonged to all 3 of those polities, It is first mentioned in the early 15th century in 1408, and at that time it was part of Principality of Moldova, which in turn was a part of Ottoman Empire. Interestingly, this very first mention of Czernowitz in 1408 actually mentions Jewish community, or not, maybe not a community, but Jews were living there, and they, as was frequently the case at those time, they had the license from the prince to collect custom duties. So it was on the border. It was on the border between Ottoman Empire and at that time Kingdom of Poland, Rzeczpospolita, and so there was an active cross-border traffic. Jews were, well, serving the function of custom officers. So this is one of the oldest maps where Czernowitz is shown. It's 1483. You can see the names, but it's highlighted in red. And so on this map, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but so to the south is Ottoman Empire, to the east what later became Russian Empire. Actually, at that point, it was Lithuania, interestingly enough. And then to the west, later on, we had Habsburg Empire or Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Czernowitz was in the Ottoman Empire from at least 15th century until late 18th century. It went to Austro-Hungary in 1776 and remained part of Austro-Hungary for almost 150 years until the end of the First World War. From 1918 till the beginning of the Second World War, it was part of Romania, and then it became part of the Soviet Union until early 1990s, when it became part of Ukraine. Those who attended Cyril Kuznitz's talk before mine have heard part of the story. I have to thank Cyril for kind of doing a big part of explanation. And the period, the 19th century, was a time when Jewish community of Czernowitz grew at a very large pace, from just several dozens families in 1776, when the first Austrian census was conducted, and up until almost half of the city population. Even so, Jews didn't constitute majority in Czernowitz. For many years, they were the plurality of population because the other groups were smaller. And this is another interesting feature. So Czernowitz was truly multinational and multi-religious. So other groups other than the Jews were Romanians, Ruthenians, which is kind of Western Ukrainian population, and Germans. Germans moved to Czernowitz when it became Austrian. So those were the largest groups, but then there were many Poles and some Armenians and Hungarians, and actually the whole list from Austrian surveys is quite long. Those other non-Jewish groups belonged to different branches of Christianity. And that was also important because there was no predominant church. So there were both Eastern Orthodox, they were Greek Catholic, so it's a church which was in between, also on the boundary between Eastern Orthodox and Catholic Church, and there were also Catholics and Protestants. So it was a mix of a number of different religious groups. Jews were against the largest one, so all other groups were significantly smaller. Jewish community of Czernowitz was not homogeneous religiously. So there were, of course, many Orthodox Jews. Early on in the first half of 19th century, there was a strong movement towards what we today would call Reform synagogue. Of course, it didn't have this name at the time, but I'll show you in a few minutes an evidence that it indeed had a number of features of what is currently known as Reform or maybe conservative Judaism. Major centers of Hasidism, and so several smaller towns around Czernowitz were seats of some of the most important Hasidic rabbis. Sadgara or Sadegura, which is right next to Czernowitz, now actually it's a part of the city, is where Ruzhiner Rebbe, Israel Friedman, moved to in the mid of 19th century. Another small shtetl called Bayan, less than 5 miles from the city center of Czernowitz, was a home of Bayaner Rebbe and Bayaner Hasidim. Vizhnitz, another town about 35 or so miles from Czernowitz, is where Vizhnitzer dynasty had their capital, and those were really major Hasidic centers. Enough to say that all of them still exist, not there, of course, but in Israel, in the United States, and in Belgium and England, and so they survived all the large movements and catastrophes of the past century. This heterogeneity of Jewish community is important because the relationships between the groups were not always smooth. Actually, at many points, they were far from friendly, and it generated tensions, but it also created a necessity to find compromises and to be able to coexist. Jews faced this internal strifes with other Jews, but collectively, all of them had to negotiate their ways with the society at large and with the governments that were replacing each other in that area, and it led to a number of interesting developments, and again I'll mention some of them. Another interesting kind of interface situation is that Czernowitz, for many years, for at least 100 years, was a kind of transit point on the way of upward social mobility. So there were, of course, there were people who lived in the city for generations, but also a significant part of Jewish population were first generation. Those were people who moved to Czernowitz from the neighboring small towns and shtetls. The directions of those moves changed over time. In the 19th and early 20th century, those were mostly Jews from Galicia, from north of Czernowitz. In the starting from 1920s and until 1950s, the direction has changed, and the Jews coming from Czernowitz were from south and east, from Bessarabia and Podolia. And so those people, many of them experienced significant cultural challenges by coming from smaller shtetl or even villages to a large city. They tried to establish themselves, but interestingly, very frequently, their children or grandchildren didn't stay in Czernowitz. They moved farther, and typically the destinations for those people were even larger cities and capitals, as a matter of fact. And we've heard some pieces of those stories earlier today, again in talks by Cyril Kuznets and Seb Schulman, where Jews from Czernowitz were, after spending some time there, moved to Vienna or Bucharest or Paris, New York, Buenos Aires, Moscow. So you just name those big places where they ended up. And again, in itself, it is not unusual, but in Czernowitz, the scale of such movement was perhaps larger than in many other places. Another very interesting aspect of, or example of boundaries is the languages. And so even from the story of changing sovereignties, it is clear that the languages have changed as well. And so during the Austrian times, the official language was German. And unlike in many other Austrian cities. Now, I need to say that Czernowitz was capital of one of the Austro-Hungarian crown lands. It's a region called Bukovina. And so hierarchically, Czernowitz belonged to this relatively small number of cities with a significant political status and prestige. And even though Czernowitz was definitely smaller than Budapest or Prague or even Brünn, but it was on the same level of the Austrian hierarchy. And unlike some other Austrian cities, Czernowitz did become German-speaking town. It was the easternmost town where the majority of population used German as their first language. For example, Lemberg, that is northwest of Czernowitz, it was a larger city than Czernowitz. It was also in German never became a prevalent language in Lemberg. And So the fact that German was present and widely spoken, of course, played a role in opening many opportunity for people in Czernowitz, because their skills were easily convertible or applicable in any part of Austro-Hungary. At the same time, a number of Jews in Czernowitz spoke Yiddish. Yiddish was their first and main language. The situation, interestingly, was not truly bilingual between Yiddish and German in Czernowitz. Frequently, in the first generation, people who came from smaller towns spoke predominantly Yiddish. They were learning German, but they were sending their children to German schools. And frequently, children did not know Yiddish well, and the third generation did not know or at least claimed not to know Yiddish at all. Shalom Aleichem, in his novel Blondine Stern, where the novel takes place in Czernowitz, makes fun of Czernowitz Jews, and one of the points he was making is that Czernowitz Jews pretend that they don't know Yiddish. However, it only stays true until they drink their first or maybe second glass of wine, after which they all of a sudden start speaking perfect Yiddish. And this, well, so besides German and Yiddish, people in Czernowitz almost had to know at least one or two other languages to carry out transactions in the markets. They had to speak at least rudimentary Ruthenian, because that's what farmers spoke who were bringing their wares to the markets. Approximately half of the rural population around Czernowitz spoke Ruthenian, another half spoke Romanian. So that was also a sort of necessary language. And then, as I mentioned before, there were many other ethnic groups with their languages, and so the linguistic picture was very diverse, and it stayed the same way after Austrian time, during both Romanian and early Soviet period as well. Czernowitz Jewish community was home to many different ideologies, extremely entrenched or well established. Cecile mentioned in her talk Nathan Birnbaum or Birnbaum in Yiddish, who was founding father of three major ideological movements of the entire Jewish world in the last century. He was one of the earliest Zionists. He actually coined the very word Zionism. Then he became an Yiddishist, and then he played an instrumental role in founding Agudas Israel, the ideological and political arm of Orthodoxy, of religious political movement. So at the same time, there were many socialists and communists and all kinds of other political movements existed and flourished in Czernowitz, particularly during the Austrian times, when there was a relatively high political freedom. It was less so during Romanian times, and of course it dropped to virtually zero level in the Soviet times. So I'd like to show an interesting example of the early observation of Jews in Czernowitz from the so it's first half of 19th century. Church of Scotland was very much interested in converting all the Jews to Christianity, and so they were sending those, they call them missions of inquiry, to the Jews in different countries. And so one of those missions on their way to Palestine passed through Czernowitz. And so that's what they wrote in the travelogue. Czernowitz is a pleasant town with streets wide, well aired and clean. The houses are 2 or 3 stories high. There are public buildings. And then they go to the Jews. So there are 3,000 Jews in town, 8 synagogues, only 3 of which are large. By the way, this observation is incomplete because while it is true that there were only 8 synagogues, there were also a lot of shtiblich, smaller places for prayer, and nobody knows exactly how many, but the number was significantly larger than 8. And then this description of religious practices. The congregation were engaged in worship when we entered, but seemed to have little feeling of devotion. And a group soon gathered around each of us in different parts of the synagogue. So we can clearly see that this synagogue and the synagogue they visited apparently was one of those neolog or again reform type synagogues, and clearly it had very distinct features of a social club that became much more prevalent later in many other parts of the world, but in Czernowitz appeared fairly early. And then the other observation from the same book is the Jews here are very ignorant, so it's not particularly or wouldn't be particularly pleasing for the Jews of Czernowitz of that time, and it is not necessarily should be taken at face value, because clearly those people had a very distinct agenda. Nevertheless, what they say in the next sentence is definitely true. Their young people are not taught to understand Hebrew, only to read it. Many send their children to the public academies where Latin and German are taught. And that indeed was the case. As I mentioned before, there was this movement to assimilate to the extent, of course, they few of those people were abandoning their Judaism altogether. They remained Jews. They continued to go to the synagogues, but the modernity came quite early to Czernowitz. So just a few examples of different ideological and political movements that I mentioned. And so Zionism was very strong. I already mentioned Nathan Birnbaum, but there were other prominent Zionists. Leon Kellner, who was professor of English at the University of Czernowitz, was close, probably the closest friend of Theodor Herzl and his confidant. He edited and published a number of Herzl's works, and actually he was the executor of Herzl literary estate after Herzl himself passed away. Meyer Ebner was another prominent Zionist figure. He was a delegate of the First Zionist Congress, and throughout entire first half of 20th century, he played one of the key leadership roles in the Zionist movement. So those were mainstream, and this is in quote marks, Zionists. But then in Czernowitz there was a very strong movement of left Zionists, or Palei Zion, and just as an illustration, this is a Palei Zion kindergarten in 1920, and you can see that the centerpiece on the wall is a big picture of Borochov, and so there was this, and the portrait of Borochov was present in all schools and cultural and other places where Palei Zion was conducting their business. So this is another picture. This is a elementary school. Actually I think that the portrait is exactly the same, so it may be even in the same room. But here is another one, and it's also interesting that here we see this triumvirate on the wall, and so the two portraits on the side are Yutlamet Peretz and Mendel Moicher's Forum, but in the center again Borochov, and of course more familiar troika of Mendel, Peretz, and Shalom Aleichem is here existing slightly different incarnation. And so this is again, this is Palei Zion High School, and those are actually all three pictures are likely from the same class that went from kindergarten in 1920 to elementary school in 1922 and high school in 1930. So then, of course, another picture, Palei Zion Sports Club, and again we see a familiar portrait on the wall. So Nathan Birnbaum was disenchanted in Zionism, became a Yiddishist, and so again, even if you didn't listen to Cyril's talk, I hope you can listen to the recording, because she presented a wonderful picture of what was happening at the Czernowitz conference. But I just wanted to show this one quote. Birnbaum considered Yiddish a weapon, and interestingly, he so in this quote he focuses on two aspects of Yiddish as a weapon: material, which is, well, everybody understands it. So if you want to reach people, you need to speak Yiddish, but also the spiritual. It is the essence of the Jewish soul. And it was also noted by Peretz in his talk at the Czernowitz conference in 1908. And Peretz makes this point that the very diversity of Czernowitz, the presence of those multiple boundaries creates a very conducive atmosphere for developing Yiddish as a language. So as you can see, all the major figures, Peretz and Shalom Aleichem, whom I already mentioned, this is a quote from Blondgen Stern, Stars by Shalom Aleichem. And again, he just couldn't resist making fun of Czernowitz. So he says, dominating the market square stood a proud grand hotel named the Black Rooster. And well, there was a proud grand hotel in the main square, but the name was not Black Rooster. So Shalom Aleichem clearly plays to kind of downgrade the ambitions of Czernowitz Jews. And then he makes another interesting point in the same chapter of The Wandering Stars. He talks about the Yiddish theater, which presents play Uriel Acosta, which was very popular play throughout Europe. It's played by Karl Gutzkow. It was not written in Yiddish, it was written in German, was translated into Yiddish, but was extremely popular on Yiddish scene as well. And so Shalom Aleichem talks about triumph and tragedy, which is sort of the main motif of the play. And he says that perhaps the triumph couldn't have been greater anywhere than Czernowitz, which had its own tragedies. And this is clearly an allusion to those various conflicts that existed, perhaps mostly within the Jewish community, just like it was happening in the play Uriel Acosta. I think I'm running out of time, and I would not be able to talk about an interesting kind of methodological findings that I wanted to describe. We know that there were Jews in Czernowitz who spoke both German and Yiddish. We don't know how many and where in the city they lived. So, but we do have Czernowitz address books where all the heads of the households of the city are listed. So it's prevalently men. There are very few females in the book. And interestingly enough, their first names can be used as proxies for the language they spoken. And again, I planned to go a little bit deeper into details, but I'll just say a few words. So those are first names in Czernowitz by frequency. You can see that in the first place is Iosif, no wonder that I'm from Czernowitz. So the most frequent name by far. And of course, Iosif could have been, so it's not exclusively Jewish. There were many non-Jews with this name, but then we also have a variant Yosel. And so when we need to identify those proxy for the language, I think it can be safely assumed that, well, those Yosels probably spoke Yiddish, and Yosefs, if they were Jews, maybe did not. And so we can actually map, because every single person has an address. We can map those names. There are other names as well. You can see there is Leib versus Leon, and there is Beryl versus Bernard. And so we can establish those pockets and densities of Yiddish-speaking population within the town, which provides some interesting insights into clustering of those groups, to what extent they were segregated or mixed together, and this makes for an really interesting story. So I'll just use a couple of minutes that are left to. I'll have to skip some of the points, but Czernowitz gave. Well, there were many prominent people from Czernowitz, a lot of poets and writers in a number of literatures, not just Yiddish, where we have some major figures, but also German and Romanian and Ukrainian and Russian and Polish. But I wanted to talk a little bit about diplomats. And so there's an unusual number of prominent diplomats who were either born in Czernowitz, or some of them were children of people from Czernowitz. Benavaiser Varan, who was one of the, or was ambassador of Israel in a number of Latin American countries. Ludwig Kleinwachter, a prominent Austrian diplomat who was an ambassador to the United States after the war and helped to bring Marshall Plan to Austria. Max Kampelman, a US ambassador who conducted, in the 1980s, conducted negotiations with the then Soviet Union on reduction of strategic arms. Unfortunately, today we learned that this the treaty that was signed 30 years ago is being discarded by Russia as we speak. Richard Shifter, Assistant Secretary of State, also an ambassador, one of the major figures for human rights negotiations in the United States. George Landau, ambassador of the United States in a number of Latin American countries. Christopher Landau, his son, recent ambassador to Mexico. Iosif Govrin, ambassador of Israel to Romania and Ukraine. Sally Bendersky, ambassador of Chile to Israel. And so it's just a random sample. Many other, and I'm not talking about just diplomats. Those are all high-ranked people, ambassadors. And I wanted to, as a final note or final anecdote, so there are those two people, and I'm sorry, there is a typo. It's Benjamin Weiss, one of the chief rabbi of Czernowitz. Czernowitz had two chief rabbis, the Orthodox and the quote unquote Reformed chief rabbi. In the late 19th century, played a very important role in the developing of relationships between Jewish community and other groups in Czernowitz. He was a personal friend of Archbishop of Czernowitz. They had very good working relationships. And then on the right, this is Mohammed Assad, who is a prominent Islamic thinker, religious figure, and diplomat also. He was one of the founders of the state of Pakistan, and he was the first ambassador of Pakistan to the United Nations. So why they are on the same slide? What is the relationship between them? Well, their grandfather and grandson. Mohammed Assad was born Leopold Weiss in Lemberg, spent all summers of his childhood in Czernowitz with his grandparents, was extremely gifted as a young man. He studied in Lemberg and Vienna, never graduated from university, but became a reporter for major German language newspapers in Europe, was sent to Palestine, and there he converted to Islam. Not just converted, but as I said, became one of the major figures in modern Islam. He translated Quran in English, which is or considered to be the best English translation of Quran. He played a critical role in establishing Pakistan as an independent state, and then again was very active on diplomatic scene. His Mohammed Assad's son, and so by the way, Assad himself wrote a book, his life story. It's called Road to Mecca, which still in print for like 70 years. And his son once remarked that he probably was one of the very few major Islamic figures who would tell Yiddish jokes to his family members. So I did not present a full picture of what was happening in Czernowitz in terms of those interesting interplays between different groups, but I hope that those kind of little pieces at least provide some taste of what it was. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. And okay, so
there's one question in the chat. If
yeah,
you...
yes. So actually, so Czernowitz was always in Bukovina, but it is true that before Bukovina became what they called crown land in Austria, it was assigned to Galicia, but Czernowitz was not in Galicia per se. And the other question, connection to neologic Judaism in Hungary, it was similar, but there were no real links. So it was kind of developing independently along the similar pathways. And thank you, Laurie. Yeah, I again tried to. If given 3 or 4 hours, I would do better, I promise. But
thank you so much. Are there any other questions? You can use the raise hand function, or just unmute and ask it. If not, we will thank you, Iosif, for the presentation.
Thank you.